The world is quickly changing. Gone are the days of having debates when you have different opinions. These days, if your opinion or your ideas are no longer aligned with the mainstream narrative, with what most people are saying, you're going to be canceled, you're going to be ridiculed, you're going to be called a nut job. And the latest example of this new phenomena is what's happening with Joe Rogan right now and Spotify. Now, if you've been living under a rock, you might not know that Joe Rogan's under a lot of fire precisely because he brought on a Dr. Robert Malone onto his podcast who had various opinions about pharmaceuticals that differ from the mainstream narrative. Now, a lot of people, a lot of powers do not like this idea. They don't like the idea that Joe Rogan has such a platform. And they're saying that he is spreading dangerous misinformation, that he should be removed. A lot of artists on Spotify have taken a stand, removing their music off Spotify just to remove the dangerous Joe Rogan, the most dangerous person in the world, Joe Rogan.
On January 24th, singer Neil Young posted a letter to his website asking Spotify to remove his music. Young did not want to share the platform with Rogan, who perpetuates disinformation about the coronavirus vaccine. Time Grammy-winning songwriter Joni Mitchell posted to her website on January 28th, "I stand with Neil Young." Other musicians such as David Crosby, a former bandmate of Young's, said he would also remove his music from the service.
We would never actually advise anything in particular, but simply gave people a platform who had opposing views to the mainstream narrative. Now, this is a very dangerous precedent that has been set. It's dangerous because if you've read the history books, you know that the same old pattern happens over and over again, where someone is labeled as a lunatic, a nut job, and they happen to have had some sort of information that was actually correct, but perhaps ahead of its time. And as a result, their discoveries were delayed into going out to mainstream public. It's very devastating. And in this video, I'm going to show you 3 examples where this scenario has repeated itself in the past so that you can learn to open yourself up to opinions that differ from your own. What is up, guys? My name is Isaac and I help people live and die well through first mastering their minds. A big part of mastering your mind is being able to entertain ideas that oppose your own, being able to listen to the person who might seem crazy in the moment, who's going against the mainstream, who's going against the large amount of evidence, because sometimes they're right and we don't want to take that away. It could be devastating. First example I want to talk about is something that happened to Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis in 1847. So this particular doctor used to deliver babies, and he noticed a very peculiar thing in his hospital. About 1 in 5 women, 18% of women, were dying during childbirth to a particular fever called childbed fever. And this was a common killer of women at the time. But something strange was happening when the midwives delivered the babies and not the doctors. The mortality rate was much lower. Women didn't die. So he did a little bit of researching. He looked at what was happening in this hospital to produce such terrible results when the doctors, the professionals, were delivering babies. And what he observed was doctors would do autopsies in one room, cut up people while they're dead, take out their organs. You know the drill. And right afterwards would go straight to delivering babies, dealing with death and birth right after each other without washing their hands, because back then that was not commonplace. There was no reason to wash your hands. People didn't really think about that. So he accurately deduced that perhaps if the doctors wash their hands with a lime solution, a chlorinated lime solution, this would provide better results. He did some experiments and the mortality rate dropped from 18% to 1% in his hospital. So you would imagine this was amazing news. This was an incredible scientific discovery that washing your hands with a simple solution would lead to more life and less death. When he brought his studies with the data to his fellow doctors, what he realized was that it went against the mainstream narrative. It went against the scientific ideas of the time, the ethos, and he was ridiculed. You see, at the time, doctors thought that because they were such, intelligent, amazing, high people in the social hierarchy, they couldn't have such disgusting things as germs, or they didn't have to wash their hands because it was beneath them, basically. This is the idea at the time. So instead of looking deeper at this guy's work, they ridiculed him, and ultimately he ended up losing his license to practice medicine. He was kicked out of the association and put into a mental home. Of course, later on, when more scientific discoveries came out, it was found that he was telling the truth, and washing your hands is actually a good thing for, killing germs and making sure weird viruses don't go around. So he was ahead of his time, but he was ridiculed at that time because it wasn't what was aligned with the mainstream narrative. It was misinformation. Now, you'd have to wonder how many thousands or possibly even millions of women died due to this one simple error that was being done by doctors. How many people could have been born if they simply put their hubris aside and decided to listen to this man? Of course they didn't, because they labeled him as conspiracy theorist, misinformation, and basically an idiot. The next story is not as tragic, it's kind of a bit more funny. You see, in the 1800s, late 1800s, a lot of men were feeling disheartened as they got older and lost a lot of their manly traits. Naturally, as you get older, testosterone levels decrease and you don't feel the way you used to when you were youthful. Your muscles atrophy and things just don't work the way they used to. So doctors at the time came up with an amazing discovery. They came up with these rejuvenation therapies based on the science of what was then called organotherapy. And the basic premise of organotherapy is that if you take tissue from a particular organ or particular brain, liver, kidney, and you put it into a sick organ, sick brain, sick kidney, whatever, it's going to help that organ develop. It's kind of similar to how people think that if you eat brains of an animal, you're gonna get some of this type of logic. So what the doctors deduced back then was that your male hormones, they didn't know about hormones back then, but your male energy came from your testes. And if you simply injected monkey balls into your balls, you would have higher levels of testosterone and you will feel like a man. So men came in hordes. These affluent men with their top hats, with their money, they came in hordes to these rejuvenation therapies and were getting all kinds of things injected into their balls. Basically, monkey balls, donkey balls, any sort of balls they could find, they were injecting into men to help them become more manly, to help them look like Henry Cavill. Now, of course, this didn't work, but it went on for a while as people thought it worked, possibly placebo effect. And people would literally bring in animals of their choosing in hopes of getting those testicles injected into theirs. And this was, of course, a huge failure in science at the time. And if you said that this was stupid, if you said that this didn't work, what you would be saying during that period of time would be called misinformation, and perhaps you'd be censored or burned. So before the 1500s, the main way that the people viewed the universe was something called the geocentric model. And this was popularized by Ptolemy of Alexandria. And what it basically said was that the Earth is the center of the universe, the most important planet ever, just the center of the whole cosmos, and everything revolves around the Earth. And it's easy to think that, if you were to just look at the sun, it looks like it's revolving around the Earth as it rises and sets, same with the moon. And this was a very popular view for the church, the Catholic Church of the time, because it was consistent with literature. The Bible talks about how the Earth and human beings are the most important things in the universe. So naturally, it would make sense for everything to revolve around the Earth, which is the most important golden gem ever. Now, a lot of scientists at the time, were adherents to this model. They went along with it, but some were brave enough to question it. One of them being Nicholas Copernicus, who did a little bit of math, and he realized that what he was being told was not consistent with how the equations were playing out in his math. So right before his death, he published his magnum opus, which talked about how the world was actually revolving around the sun. You know, we revolved around the sun, which of course is correct, but this was heresy at the time. This was a controversial, something you couldn't say. It was just pure misinformation. Now, Nicholas Copernicus didn't really catch too much heat from that because he died shortly afterwards, and people didn't really talk about it. It was kind of buried, and the geocentric view of the world continued. Now, a couple years later, a young hustler by the name of Galileo Galilei made some improvements on the telescope, which allowed him to see different planets from very far away. And he realized that, oh wait, shit, Nicholas was right. The Earth revolves around the sun. You know, we're not the center of the universe. There's something more going on here. So he brought his discoveries to the mainstream science, and of course was ridiculed. The church told him, hey man, you better stop that shit. You better not talk about that. And of course he didn't listen and was then put on trial for heresy and left in house arrest, where he shortly afterwards died. It's because his views were at the time misinformation. They went against the mainstream narrative. Now, many years later, the Catholic Church actually had to make an apology for Galileo because obviously they ruined this man's life and he was right. But this was way past the fact. So when you look at all these stories, and there's plenty more, these are just 3 that I picked, you see that human beings have a tendency of getting things wrong. And the only way we can improve on our knowledge is by having open dialogue, having debates, not throwing anything out as basically nonsense or misinformation, because as soon as you label something as misinformation, as soon as you label something as not being worth inquiry, you limit your options. And sometimes the options you're limited to are wrong and you go backwards. Science is about getting to the truth. When you are not doing that and you're using propaganda, you're censoring people, you're silencing people, you're not having open debates, you're not investigating all possibilities, you're falling victim to something called scientism, which is akin to dogmatic religions, which is akin to basically a cult. And this is not the way for humans to move forward. This is not the way for you to approach your life. You need to be open to many opposing views, because you're not always going to be right, regardless of how certain you are. There at times are things that you do not know, and those things can be very beneficial to you in the long run. So when you are on your journey to becoming the best version of yourself, to creating the perfect reality, don't fall for this dogmatic view of the world. Don't fall for this cancel culture where we're just going around and trying to cancel people for just having any opinion that's against the mainstream, because that's bullshit. That shows a lack of intellectual prowess. You know, you're just going with the flow. You're being told what to do, like a dog, like a little lap dog. Don't be like that. Dare to think differently, dare to entertain things that others won't, and you will be one step closer to living and dying well. Thanks for watching the video. I appreciate you. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell notifications so we can see more of each other. Until next time.